Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, The ENT Resident. Today I'll be discussing about anatomy of the tongue. Now this is a very important long question for anatomy students in first year of MBBS as well as for students who are in their third year doing ENT as well as postgraduates of ENT. Now within this I'll be discussing about what are the functions of the tongue, what are the different parts of the tongue, what does the structure look like, and I'll be discussing a little bit more about the papillae of the tongue, what are the different types of it, a little bit about the taste buds, a little overview about what are the muscles of the tongue, and last of all, the nerve supply, the blood supply, and the lymphatic drainage of the tongue. So let's begin. So the tongue is a solid conical muscular organ, and it is located partly in the oral cavity, as you see in this portion. This is the oral cavity and this is the floor of the mouth. So it's located partly in the oral cavity in the floor of the mouth, and a part of it is in the pharynx. As you can see, this is the pharynx. This part of the tongue lies in the pharynx. Coming to the functions of the tongue, as we all know, the main function of the tongue is that it is an organ of taste, and it also helps you with mastication, deglutition, and speech. Other than this primary functions, there are some other little functions which are not as important, but they are like helps in moistening the lips. They are used in gestures and postures of facial expressions, and very, very rarely, tongue prints can be used to see the pattern of lingual papilla for medical legal purposes for personal identification. Next, we come on to the different parts of the tongue. Now, as you see in the picture, the different parts of the tongue are, first of all, there's the tip of the tongue here, the base of the tongue, this portion over here, which is directed backwards towards the oropharynx, the dorsal surface of the tongue, the inferior surface, which you're not able to see, which is beneath the surface, which is beneath this part, the two lateral borders of the tongue, and the root of the tongue, which gets attached to the floor of the mouth. So these are the different parts of the tongue. Now let's talk a little bit about the different parts. First of all, the tip. As you can see in this image, the tip of the tongue is directed forwards from here, and it comes in contact with the incisors of your teeth in front. Next, coming to the base of the tongue. The base of the tongue is directed backwards towards the oropharynx, as I just said, and it is formed by the posterior one-third of the tongue. Now, you'll see that this is the base of the tongue, and there's a structure behind the base of the tongue which is known as the epiglottis, as you can see over here. Now, the mucous membrane over this base of the tongue gets reflected onto the epiglottis, and there are these folds which connect the base of the tongue and the epiglottis. This is the median glossoepiglottic fold, and on both sides are the two lateral glossoepiglottic folds. Now these folds reflect onto the epiglottis and connects to it. Now, as a result of this, what happens is on each side, this is the median fold, on each side of the median fold, a depression forms. As you can see over here, these two depressions are known as the vallecula. Next, we move on to the dorsum of the tongue. The dorsum of the tongue is convex on all sides and it is covered with mucous membrane. And the dorsum of the tongue is divided by a V-shaped sulcus terminalis into two parts, the anterior two-third and the posterior one-third. You can see in this image over here, this is the sulcus terminalis. This is a V-shaped sulcus. Now, this sulcus is dividing the base of the dorsum of the tongue into an anterior two-third. This is the anterior two-third. This is also known as the oral part or the presulcal part of the tongue. And the posterior one-third over here, the posterior one-third is also known as the pharyngeal part or the postsulcal part of the tongue. Now, as you can see here, the sulcus terminalis, I showed you the sulcus over here. Now, these sulcus terminalis begins at a point where there is a central depression. You can see over here. There is a central depression over here, which is known as the foramen cecum. The sulcus terminalis commences from here and it runs forward and laterally, like this. And this foramen cecum, there's a question that sometimes you are asked in Viva if you have gotten a case of a tongue carcinoma. where they can ask you what is the foramen cecum. The foramen cecum is basically, it indicates the start of median thyroid ruminant as thyroglossal duct. It is a developmental part, it is a rudimentary part of the development process. So if someone asked you what is the foramen cecum, you can say that the foramen cecum is a central depression in the dorsum of the tongue, which indicates the start of the median thyroid ruminant as a thyroglossal duct. Next, we move on to the inferior surface. The inferior surface is covered by mucous membrane, but there is a difference over here. The rest of the tongue, the mucous membrane has papillae on it. I'll come to that in a little bit and I'll talk more about it. But the inferior surface of the tongue, the mucous membrane is slightly different in the sense that it is devoid of papillae and is reflected onto the floor of the mouth. And there are two things you need to know, two features that you need to know about the inferior surface. The first one is called frenulum linguae. This is a median fold which is connecting the tongue to the floor of the mouth. You can see in the image over here, this fold that you see over here is the frenulum linguae. So you can see that this is the tongue and this is the floor of the mouth. It is a median fold which is connecting both structures. And what is the importance of this median fold? You will see on the both sides of these medial folds, there are these two little openings over here on both sides. And these are called the sublingual papillae. Now, what is the importance of sublingual papillae? These are the papillae through which the submandibular duct opens into the oral cavity. So the submandibular duct will be transporting the saliva from the submandibular gland and it will open up into the oral cavity through these sublingual papillae on either side of the frenulum linguae. If we had to talk about the applied importance or the clinical importance of frenulum linguae, it's that in case in some children you would see that the frenulum linguae is shorter than usual. In that case, what it leads to is a condition called as the tongue tie. And when you have a tongue tie as a result of a shortened frenulum linguae, there is disturbance in the speech of the child. And the next part, on each side of the frenulum linguae, you will find something called as the plica fimbriata. Now, plica fimbriata, it passes upwards and medially. And I'll show you over here. So this is the frenulum linguae. On either side of it, the plica fimbriata passes upwards and medially. And in between the plica fimbriata and the frenulum linguae runs a vein which is known as the profunda lingua vein. So that's all about the inferior surface of the tongue. So the important part is to remember the frenulum linguae and the clinical importance of it, which is tongue tie, which will lead to disturbance of speech. And secondly, the plica fimbriata, which passes upwards and medially. And in between these two structures is the profunda lingua vein. Now we'll come to the lateral margins of the tongue. There's not much over here. Lateral margins are just covered with mucous membrane, and the palatoglossal arch is attached to the margin at junction of anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So you see over here, these are the palatoglossal arches. And when it comes down and it gets attached to the lateral margin of the tongue, it attaches at the junction of the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And last of all is the root of the tongue. Now, root of the tongue, as I had mentioned right in the beginning, it's a part of the tongue which is getting attached to the floor of the mouth. It extends from symphysis menti to hyoid bone, and it is formed by the lower fibers of the genioglossus muscle. Okay, next we move on to the structure of the tongue. So the tongue consists of the following things. First of all, there's the mucous membrane, there are mucous glands, there's lymphoid tissue, there's fat, striated muscle fibers, and fibrous tissue. So when you're in your histology classes, there's a very important question that comes up in your anatomy classes. What is the type of mucous membrane on the tongue? So, the mucous membrane of the tongue is a stratified squamous type of epithelium. This is very, very important to remember. Now, this mucous membrane itself has a lot of different features in the different parts of the tongue. It's not uniform throughout the tongue. So, I have told you the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is known as the presulcal part, and the posterior one-third of the tongue is known as the postsulcal part of the tongue. Mucous membrane in each of this is a little bit different. In the presulcal part of the tongue, the mucous membrane is very adherent to the underlying muscles by the lamina propria and is provided with numerous papillae of different types. This is a very important feature of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, that they present with a lot of papillae of the tongue, which I will talk about in the next part. And the postsulcal part of the tongue, the mucous membrane here is devoid of any papillae. So, this is a very important distinguishing feature right over here. It is devoid of any papillae and it is separated from the underlying muscle by a loose submucous coat. This submucous layer contains mucus and serous glands and a lot of numerous lymphatic follicles, which are known as lingual tonsils. So, the image over here, I'll show you. This is the posterior one-third of the tongue. And over here, you can see these are the two lingual tonsils. Lingual tonsils are basically an aggregation of lymphoid follicles, and this lingual tonsil forms a part of a lymphoid ring inside us, which is known as the Waldear's ring. I have another video which is just dedicated to describing the different structures of the Waldear's ring and what is the importance of Waldear's ring in our body. So, lingual tonsil contributes to that ring. Now, we come on to the next part where we'll be discussing about the different types of papillae. Now, what is a papillae? A papillae is a projection of the lamina propria covered by the mucous membrane. As I told you, the first layer of the tongue is the mucous membrane, and underneath that there is lamina propria, and underneath that there is the underlying muscles. So this lamina propria projects onto the mucous membrane and forms structure called the papillae. Now there are four different types of papillae that you need to know about. The first papillae is the Vallate papillae. Now, I'll show you the Vallate papillae right over here. You can see these structures over here. This is the sulcus terminalis, as I had showed you. And the sulcus terminalis divides the tongue into the anterior two-thirds and the posterior one-third of the tongue. Now, this Vallate papillae, they are about like 8 to 12 in number, and they are arranged in a V-shaped single row immediately in front and parallel to the sulcus terminalis. As you can see right over here, these are the Vallate papillae. And each papillae is a truncated conical structure with the broad base which is directed towards the surface of the tongue, and it is surrounded by a central sulcus. And the walls of these sulcus present with taste buds which receives the duct of serous glands. These are the Vallate papillae. Next, we come on to the fungiform papillae. Now, fungiform papillae are these rounded reddish elevations which are situated along the sides of the tongue, as you can see over here. These are the fungiform papillae. These will be present along the sides of the tongue. These are not as big as the Vallate papillae. They are slightly smaller structures which are rounded reddish elevations. And why are they reddish? They are reddish because of the rich vascular supply. So these are the fungiform papillae. These papillae also contain the taste buds. Next, we come to the foliate papillae. Now, these foliate papillae can be present or they can be not present as well or very few in number. These are these 3 to 4 vertical mucous folds which are present along the margin of the tongue in front of the sulcus terminalis. I'll show you here. As you can see, these vertical folds over here. These folds on either side of the tongue, right in front of the sulcus terminalis, this is the sulcus terminalis, these are called as the foliate papillae. These also contain taste buds, but these are not very prominent in humans and they are more prominently found in rabbits. And the last type of papillae, the filiform papillae. These filiform papillae are very tiny conical projections, and there are a lot of them in number, and they are all over the anterior two-thirds of the dorsum of the tongue. And they'll be arranged in a series of V-shaped rows parallel to the sulcus terminalis, except at the close to the apex of the tongue where they get transversely oriented. And the most important part of this filiform papillae is the fact that it is devoid of taste buds. All the other three papillae, the Vallate, the Fungiform, and the Foliate papillae, they contain taste buds. Filiform papillae are the only ones which do not contain any taste buds. And another very important feature of this is that the tips of these papillae over here, the epithelial cells, they are keratinized. So, as a result of the keratinization, it gives that rough feel to the surface of the tongue, which helps you in grasping food. Now, I'll show you over here. These are the parts. This is the part which is full of this papillae, and they are devoid of taste bud, and the keratinization on these epithelial cells are providing you with a rough surface which helps you in grasping food. So we have discussed about all the four types of papillae. You have to remember the large ones are the Vallate papillae, which are 8 to 12 in number. They are located just in front of the sulcus terminalis in a V-shaped manner. Second one is a fungiform papillae, which are these rounded reddish elevations along the sides of the tongue. They are red. Why? Because of the rich vascularity. Third one is the foliate papillae, which are these 3 to 4 vertical mucous folds you may find in front of the sulcus terminalis on the side of the tongue, but they are not very prominent. They are more prominent in rabbits. So these three are containing taste buds. And the last papillae, the one known as the filiform papillae, there are numerous projections all over the dorsum of the tongue in the anterior two-third, and these are devoid of taste bud, and they give the rough surface to the tongue which helps you in grasping food. So these are all about the papillae of the tongue. Next, we'll talk about the taste buds. Now, taste buds. What are taste buds exactly? They're basically modified epithelial cells which are arranged in a spherical masses within the epithelium of the tongue. Not just the tongue, actually. So, this is another thing that you need to remember. Which are the parts of the oral cavity where you find taste buds? So, the taste buds are found in the tongue, on the surface of the tongue, except for the inferior surface, as I have mentioned to you before. The inferior surface of the soft palate, the palatoglossal arches, the posterior surface of epiglottis, and posterior wall of oropharynx. So these are all the places where you will find taste buds. So it's a usual misconception that taste buds are only found on the tongue because the tongue is the organ of taste, but that is not the case. We have taste buds in other locations as well, as I've just mentioned. So now we'll talk about the taste bud. What does the structure of a taste bud look like? So each taste bud is made up of a lot of slender spindle-shaped pale cells, some of which are these sensory cells of taste, and the others are all supporting cells. As you see in the image of over here, these are the gustatory receptor cells, and the cells that you see in between over here, the pinkish ones, these are the supporting cells. And each bud opens onto the surface of the epithelium by an aperture which is known as, over here, as you can see, this is the gustatory pore or the taste pore, through which the gustatory hair projects on to the microvilli. Now, the base of the bud is penetrated by the gustatory nerve fibers, as you can see. This is the base, and these are the sensory neurons which is supplying the taste buds. And the taste buds are opening onto the surface of the mucous membrane through the gustatory pore, and through which there are numerous projections known as the gustatory hair. Now, functionally, why do we have taste buds? To get the taste of different food. Now, what are the different subjective taste sensations, and which part of the tongue do you appreciate these different sensations in? Now, functionally, there are 4 types of subjective taste sensations which are appreciated by our tongue. Sweet and salt is appreciated at the tip, as you can see over here. salt on both the sides and sweet at the center. The tip of the tongue senses the sweet and the salt. And on the sides of the tongue detects the sour taste. And last of all, the pharyngeal part of the tongue detects bitterness right over here. So these are the different sensations that are felt by the tongue. Next, we'll move on to the different muscles of the tongue. Now, the tongue is divided into two symmetrical halves by a median fibrous septum. I'll show you an image over here. Yeah, right over here, you can see this is the median fibrous septum, which divides the tongue into two halves, two symmetrical halves. Now, coming back to the muscles of the tongue. Now, as a result of this median fibrous septum, which is coronally oriented in the tongue, and it is attached below to the hyoid bone, forming the hypoglossal membrane. Now, each half of the tongue has striated muscles which are arranged in two groups, extrinsic muscles and intrinsic muscles. Now, there has to be a difference in the function of the extrinsic and the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. So, the difference in function is that the extrinsic muscles are responsible for altering the position of the tongue, and the intrinsic muscles are responsible for altering the shape of the tongue. So, the extrinsic muscle for the position of the tongue, and the intrinsic muscle for the shape of the tongue. The different extrinsic muscles are genioglossus, hyoglossus, chondroglossus, styloglossus, and palatoglossus. And the intrinsic muscles are superior longitudinal, inferior longitudinal, transversus linguae, and verticalis linguae. Now, I will not be talking much about the muscles of the tongue here. In my next video, I will discuss more in details about these different muscles. Where is their origin? Where is their insertion? What is the nerve supply? And what are the different functions of each of these muscles? And we'll also be talking about the relations of hypoglossal muscle, which is again a very important long question in your theory papers. So as you can see, these are the extrinsic muscles of the tongue. The styloglossus muscle, because it starts from the styloid process, the palatoglossal muscles here within the palatoglossal arch, the genioglossus muscle, and the hyoglossus muscle. And right over here are on the right side are the intrinsic muscles, the superior longitudinal muscle, the inferior longitudinal muscle, transversus muscle, and verticalis. We'll talk about this in the next video. Now that we have discussed about the muscles of the tongue, let's talk about what is the nerve supply of the tongue. Now, this is a very tricky, like a viva question, because a lot of us get confused about the motor supply of the tongue. So let's divide nerve supply into motor as well as sensory supply. First, we'll talk about the motor supply. Now, first, amongst motor supply is the somatomotor supply. Somatomotor means the nerves that are supplying the muscles of the tongue. So you have to remember, just you have to mug this up completely, because you just have to vomit it out every time the examiner asks you this question: what is the supply of the tongue? Also, when somebody is asking you about the supply of the tongue, it's not just about the muscle. Always remember to say the nerve supply of the tongue is divided into two parts: the motor supply and the sensory supply. Usually, what I have also ended up doing in my MBBS is I have ended up responding like, oh, I know this answer, and I've responded with all muscles of the tongue are supplied by this except for this muscle, and I thought I knew the whole answer, but I was wrong. If you come to the nerve supply, it is always divided into a motor supply and the sensory supply. Even within the motor supply, there are different parts. First, let's talk about the muscular supply, which is the somatomotor supply. All the muscles of the tongue, the extrinsic and the intrinsic, they are supplied by hypoglossal nerve, except for palatoglossus, which is supplied by the cranial part of the accessory nerve via the pharyngeal plexus. So let's say it again. All the muscles of the tongue, extrinsic and intrinsic both, they are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve, except for the palatoglossus muscle, which is supplied by the cranial part of the accessory nerve via the pharyngeal plexus. This is about the somatomotor supply. Next is about the secretomotor supply. So the secretomotor supply starts from the superior salivatory nucleus. Then it travels via the facial nerve, then next branches out to the chorda tympani nerve, to the lingual nerve, which then relays in the submandibular ganglion. And after relaying in the submandibular ganglion, the postganglionic fibers are supplied by the lingual nerve. So, this is the secretomotor supply of the tongue. What do you mean by secretomotor? The ones that are helping in secretion in the tongue, the different secretions that come out of the tongue. So, this is the secretomotor supply. I'll be talking more about the taste pathway in a different video, which is a whole other big topic to be talking about. The last part in the motor supply of the tongue is the vasomotor supply. That is the nerve that is supplies the vessels. These are derived from the sympathetic nerves around the lingual artery, and these convey the postganglionic fibers from the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic trunk. So these were the three motor supplies. First was a somatomotor, second is secretomotor, and third is vasomotor. What does somatomotor mean? It means the supply to the muscles of the tongue. Secretomotor means the supply for the secretions of the tongue. And third of all, vasomotor means supply to the vessels which are supplying the tongue. Next, we come on to the sensory supply. Now, this is again a very tricky Viva question, and every time we are asked, like in your Viva, like what is the sensory supply of the tongue, we kind of mess it up in our head a little bit because it's very different for the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And the difference in the sensations, the sensory supply for these both parts of the tongue arises from its developmental perspective. The two anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, they have different developmental origin, as a result of which the nerve supply of both the parts of the tongue is also different. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, it develops from the first pharyngeal arch, whereas the posterior 1/3 develops from the second and the third pharyngeal arch. So as a result of which you will see the first pharyngeal arch, again, when you divide the sensory supply, can again be divided into two parts: general sensations and special sensations. Now, the general sensation of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is supplied by the lingual nerve, and the special sensations are supplied by the chorda tympani nerve. Whereas the general as well as the special sensations for the posterior third of the tongue is supplied by one nerve, which is known as the glossopharyngeal nerve. So this is very important to remember. Why is the nerve supply different for both the parts of the tongue? It arises because of the difference in the developmental origin of both parts of the tongue. And I'll be discussing more about the development of the tongue in another video, which is again in itself is a long question. And lastly, there's another part which I told you, structure called the vallecula. The vallecula, I told you, is formed by a reflection of the mucous membrane from the posterior third of the tongue onto the epiglottis. And because of the two folds, the median and the lateral glossoepiglottic folds, there is a depression that forms on either side of the median fold, which is known as the vallecula. And this vallecula does not have the same sensory supply as the rest of the tongue. This is supplied by the internal laryngeal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve. I have discussed more about vallecula in my previous videos in anatomy of larynx, so you can check it out over there. Okay, now we are done with the nerve supply of the tongue. Next, we move on to the blood supply. Now, in the blood supply, you always divide blood supply into arterial supply and venous drainage. So, what is the main artery or the chief artery of the tongue? The chief artery of the tongue is the lingual artery. And where does lingual artery originate from? Lingual artery is a branch of the external carotid artery. And now this lingual artery itself has different branches, and amongst them the dorsal linguae branches supplies the pharyngeal parts, and the rest of the tongue is supplied by the arteria profunda linguae. So this was the chief artery of the tongue. There are some other arteries which also supply the tongue, which include the ascending palatine and the tonsillar branches of the facial artery, and the ascending pharyngeal artery, which is again a branch of the external carotid artery. When in Viva questions, when you're asked about an artery of the tongue, invariably the next question is, which artery is this a branch of? So if you have said lingual artery, there'll always be a follow-up question: which artery is lingual artery a branch of? So you always have to know the principal artery. So this was about the arterial supply. As you can see in the image over here, this is the external carotid artery, and from that originates the sublingual artery. And from the sublingual artery, there's arteria profunda linguae and the dorsal linguae arteries. Next, coming to the venous drainage. Now, the veins of the tongue, they get arranged in two sets, superficial veins and the deep veins. Now, both of them ultimately end up in the internal jugular vein, but their pathway is kind of different. So, the superior veins, they drain only the tip and the undersurface of the tongue, whereas the deep veins, they drain the dorsum of the tongue and accompanies the lingual artery. So first we'll talk about the superior veins. They drain the tip and the undersurface of the tongue. Then they pass superficial to the hyoglossus, accompanying the hypoglossal nerve, and they ultimately terminate into the internal jugular vein. Whereas the deep veins, they drain the dorsum of the tongue, accompanying the lingual artery, and they pass deep to the hyoglossus, and they also terminate into the internal jugular vein, either directly or after joining the superficial vein. So you have to remember ultimately the both the veins they drain into the internal jugular vein, but they follow a different path and they have different drainage. I'm sorry, that's not the right thing to say. They have different areas that they are draining, but they ultimately lead into the same vein, which is the internal jugular vein. Last of all, we'll be talking about the lymphatic drainage of the tongue. This is an extremely difficult topic to remember, as well as very important because it has a lot of clinical importance in how because the lymphatic drainage of the tongue is a little bit complex and it goes into different nodes from different areas of the tongue. This decides if you have a carcinoma of the tongue. Depending on which part of the tongue has been involved in the carcinoma, it will determine which nodes will involve in the in the neck. So, to know the spread of carcinoma of the tongue, depending on which part of the tongue has been involved, which neck node will be involved, first we have to know what is the lymphatic drainage of the tongue. So, the lymphatic drainage, they consist of intramuscular and submucosal plexus, and they get arranged in four sets. As you can see over here, this is the apical drainage, there is the marginal drainage, there is the dorsal drainage, and there is the central drainage. So, this is the drainage of the tongue. There are four groups. Now, we'll talk about each group. The first group is the apical set. The apical set is responsible for draining the tip and the frenulum linguae, and it terminates in three ways. The first, most common way, some of the vessels they pierce the muscle mylohyoid and they drain into the submental nodes. And a few vessels pass down in front of the hyoid bone and they drain directly into the jugulo-omohyoid nodes. So, this is the main drainage. Some of them may pierce the mylohyoid and instead of draining into the submental nodes, which is the 1A lymphatic nodes, they drain into the submandibular nodes, which is the class 1B. I've spoken about the different lymphatic levels of the neck in another video. You can check me out over there. And so this is the second pathway of drainage from the apical set. And the last pathway is a few of the vessels they can pass deep to mylohyoid and terminate in jugulodigastric or jugulo-omohyoid nodes. So this is about the apical set drainage. So if you see over here in the image, this is the apical nodes. Some of them drain into the submental nodes, which is right over here. Some of them go to the submandibular nodes over here, and some of them can go to the jugulo-omohyoid or jugulodigastric nodes. Next, we move on to the next set, which is the marginal set. Now, the marginal set of lymph nodes, they drain the side of the tongue in front of the sulcus terminalis. And they again have two different types of drainage. Some vessels can pierce mylohyoid and they drain into the submandibular nodes. And some vessels they can pass deep to the mylohyoid and drain into the jugulodigastric and jugulo-omohyoid nodes. If you see over here in this image, This is the marginal nodes, which is basically draining the side of the tongue in front of the sulcus terminalis. This is the sulcus terminalis. And some of them, they will either go into the submandibular nodes, which is right over here, or some of them will end up going to the jugulo-omohyoid or the jugulodigastric nodes. Next, we come to the central set of lymph nodes. The central set of lymph nodes drain the dorsal surface of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue in front of the Vallate papillae. These group of lymph nodes, they descend between the two genioglossus muscle, and then they have two pathways. One pathway, they either go into the jugulodigastric or the jugulo-omohyoid nodes without piercing the mylohyoid muscle, or the second pathway is when some of them pierce the mylohyoid and drain into the submandibular nodes. And last of all are the dorsal set or the basal set. This dorsal set of lymph nodes, it drains the posterior one-third of the tongue, including the Vallate papillae. And they again have two drainage. Most of the vessels will drain bilaterally. It is important to remember the word bilaterally over here, because in these cases, if a carcinoma of the tongue involves the dorsum of the tongue, there is a higher possibility of the bilateral involvement of the neck nodes, which will change the staging of your cancer right over there. So, most vessels will drain bilaterally into jugulodigastric nodes after piercing the pharyngeal wall. And a lesser pathway is one of the vessel passes downward behind the tongue and the hyoid, pierces the thyrohyoid membrane, and it drains directly into the jugulo-omohyoid nodes. So these are the dorsal or the basal set. You'll see in the image over here, this is the dorsal set, and they go bilaterally into the jugulo-omohyoid nodes. So this is about the lymphatic drainage and the different sets. Lastly, a little bit more about the lymphatic drainage. There are some peculiar features in the lymphatic drainage of the tongue. First of all is the fact that the lymphatics do not accompany blood vessels over here in the tongue. Second, in the middle of the tongue, I told you there is a median fibrous septum which divides the tongue into two symmetrical halves. In the middle of the tongue, a free decussation takes place of the lymphatics and they end up passing bilaterally, as I've just mentioned in the above part in the dorsal set. Third point is the tip of the tongue has the richest supply. So, the clinical importance of this particular point is the fact that if there is a carcinoma affecting the tip of the tongue, there is a higher propensity that it will spread to all the cervical lymph nodes on both the sides of the neck. This is very important because this leads to a more severe staging of the tongue carcinoma because of involvement of bilateral lymph nodes and most of the lymph nodes being involved. Last of all, a group of lymph nodes situated at bifurcation of common carotid artery. This is known as the principal lymph nodes of the tongue. So this has all been about the anatomy of the tongue. I'll be making two more videos on anatomy of tongue. One will be about the muscles of the tongue, where I'll talk more in details about the classification of the muscle, the origin, insertion, nerve supply, and action of each of those muscles. And the second video will be about the development of the tongue, which will explain why the nerve supply of the anterior two-third and the posterior one-third of the tongue is so different. So that's all for today. If you have any questions, you can write down in the comment section and I'll get back to you. Thank you.